So for how many of you, this morning is your first time back after all of this? Awesome. How many of you, this is your second week back? Because we've been doing this for 2 weeks now. Awesome as well. What do you think about the communion wafer there? I mean, we're doing what we can do, right? And this is what we have to do. At the same time, sometimes, I mean, in times past, someone might complain that we do the homemade communion bread here, right? And so the communion bread it's too done, or it's not done enough. Now I promise you that whoever's complaining is not making the communion bread, right? It's too done, or it's just not done enough. I promise you that from this point forward, no one will ever complain about that homemade communion bread ever in the future. I really appreciate you being here today. I appreciate those of you who are joining us at a distance. The blessing that it is to be gathered together as the people of God and recognizing that God is doing what God is doing in and through and in spite of us. And I think maybe even more so now than ever before, we're reminded of the connection that we truly possess in and through the gospel of Jesus. And we also recognize that even those of us who are perhaps introverted, we yearn for community. We're created to exist in communion with one another. And so I am thankful for the blessing of this time together. On this series of lessons, during this series of lessons that we've been considering over the last several months now, one continuous story. We began this the first week of March, and then, of course, a couple of weeks into March, then all of this sort of began to happen. And at first thought, my consideration was maybe we should not try to do a series of lessons during this time. But I think it's been maybe the right route to take. It helps to kind of gain or to maintain some momentum and to have some continuity during a time where we don't have a whole lot of continuity. And I am so very thankful for so many of you who have connected to this week after week and have journeyed as we have journeyed together through this study. At the same time, 66 books in the Bible over a period of 40 weeks. Come on, right? I'm the guy that spends, 10 weeks and 4 verses. Not 40 weeks and 66 books. But along the way, what we've been trying to do is to consider these broad sweeping themes that are found within the Bible and to connect, not only to connect to what God was doing then, but to connect our lives to what God is doing now and the potential that God has in being at work in and through us. Before I went to college, before I went to graduate school, I went to a preaching school. Those of you who are BRC squared, Born and Raised Church of Christ, maybe you know what I'm talking about. I went to the Center for Christian Education. Most of you are more familiar with the name prior to that, the Preston Road School of Preaching. Look out, I see a few head nods, okay? Fewer than I thought. But the Preston Road School of Preaching, the Center for Christian Education, and I've been doing, some remembering lately, thinking back to that time in my life, during that part of my formal education, thinking back to how God was forming me and shaping me in and through that, not just with the level of instruction, which I'm a little bit biased, but was phenomenal. And even going to other colleges and universities after that, the level of instruction there was just so formative for me. I was in a master's level class at Lubbock Christian, and it was first day of class, and there's a guy up front who's talking about this preaching school that he had, and he was an older guy. And now that I think about it, he was probably about my age whenever he said this. But this older guy who was up at the front of the class and who was saying that he had gone to this preaching school and a similar sort of thing, just how formative it had been for him. And I asked him, I said, "Where'd you go to school at?" And he said, "The Preston Road School of Preaching." I've been thinking about just that time in my life lately, and for how God was at work in and through all of that. And I'm remembering a general philosophy of many of the professors there. It was just a 2-year program, at a non-accredited school. The school was geared toward preaching, but the credit hours, they weren't accredited credit hours. Does that make sense? I'm moving forward. But going to the school there, the philosophy of the professors was, in 2 years' time, you're not going to learn everything there is to know about the Bible. Of course, a lifetime only scratches the surface. But what was talked about so very overtly by the professors there was, we're not here to teach you everything there is to know about the Bible. We are here to teach you to think for yourself. And that's some of what I'm wanting for us to get out of this study of Scripture. I want for us to be able to look back in years ahead at these 40 weeks that we spent as a church family journeying through these 66 books of the Bible, journeying together during a pandemic, during social upheaval, journeying together during this time as a church family, and to be able to look back in years ahead and to say, God was doing some good stuff back then. God was at work within us. And yet, in order for God to do that, you and I have got to be paying attention. We've got to be paying attention to what God is doing in and through all of this. And so this morning, we're going to hit pause and consider the story of Joshua, if you want to go ahead and find your way there. And as we consider Joshua's story, my goal today is that we'd not only be astounded by the faith of the people of God then. My goal is that we would be astounded by what God calls us to as a people of faith today. And so this morning is going to be probably more teaching than preaching, but I want to consider the story of Joshua, especially the first 6 chapters, and then we're going to skip to chapter 24. But turn with me, if you will, to Joshua chapter 1. In Joshua chapter 1, the affirmation of God to Joshua is this: be strong, be courageous, don't be afraid. Let's all stand and sing. That's the call of God to Joshua. Be strong, be courageous, don't be afraid. It's the same words that he had given Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Look at how Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 begins. Let me read these beginning verses. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all of these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land that I am about to give to them, the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea to the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. This is what God is communicating to Joshua as he is going to be leading God's people. Nothing's going to get in your way. I'm going to be with you. No one will be able to stand against you all of your days. As I was with Moses, so I will also be with you. I will never leave you, nor forsake you. Jesus echoes these words. I will never leave you, nor forsake you. Verse 6, be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. God is echoing the promises He's made for generations. Verse 7, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. This is good instruction for us. Verses 8 and 9, keep this book of the law always upon your lips. Meditate upon it night and day, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid. Don't be discouraged. For the Lord, your God, He will be with you wherever you go. God says, Joshua, I'm going to be with you. Now remember, this is the same Joshua who, after being sent out with Caleb and 10 others to go into the promised land, after being sent out by Moses, this is the same Joshua who comes back with Caleb and who says, even though things look difficult and dismal and bleak out in the big wide world, God's with us. We can do this. Regardless of the obstacles that stand in the way, God is for us. And Joshua and Caleb, they return and they have this faith that we should imitate. There's strength in their faith. God is with us. And that's all that matters. Yes, there's angst. Yes, there's hostility. Yes, there's uncertainty. But God is with us. For us, it would be, yes, there's angst. Yes, there's hostility. Yes, there's uncertainty on every news outlet available. And yet God is with us. And that's what matters. The Apostle Paul echoes those words in Romans chapter 8. If God is with us, what can stand against us? And yet even still, even amidst all of that faith, God, He knows what Joshua needs to hear. Because as bold and as courageous, as faithful as Joshua is, he's also human. He also struggles. He also has doubts. And so God affirms to Joshua, be strong, be courageous, don't be afraid. And He affirms it over and over and over again. Because he's facing the unknown. And for us, for you and I, it's oftentimes in the unknown of life that we need this affirmation most. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. You and I, we want control. We want certainties. We want to know what the outcome is going to be before the process begins. We want to know how things are going to go with whatever dark cloud is looming ahead without ever facing that dark cloud with faith. But it's precisely within the unknown that our God, He calls for you and I to be strong and courageous and to not be afraid. That's chapter 1. With me so far? All right, chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, there is this hero of the Bible, Rahab. This hero whose story is told. Now she's an unlikely hero, right? For the sake of little ears in the audience, I'll just say that Rahab had an interesting way of making a living, did she not? And so Rahab has this interesting way of making a living, but God, He works and He ministers through her in order to bring about this wonder, not only among His people then, but something that we as people, the people of God today, can look to. I had a professor who oftentimes, in regard to our being broken people and God doing His work through us, he would say that God draws straight lines through crooked sticks, talking about us. And so Joshua chapter 2, we're told the story of Rahab, who houses in Jericho, this city in which God is going to give Israel this victory. Rahab, she hides 2 of Joshua's men from the authorities because she has the faith that the Hebrews, the Israelites, that they're the people of God. And so in return for her hiding them, she and her family are spared when Jericho falls. And for those of you who know the story, do you remember what it is that's placed outside of the window of Rahab's home there in the city wall that designated that this was where she dwelled? There was this red cord, this red piece of rope that hung outside of the window so that Israel, as they attacked the city, that they would know where she and her family dwelled so that they might be spared, so that they might be saved. It's the same image that we saw at the Passover, is it not? Whereas as the Passover occurs there in Exodus, and as Israel is freed from their Egyptian slavery, those who dwell under the blood of the Lamb are saved. And so it's the same sort of imagery that we see in the Passover. And this is important. Rahab's story is important because when you look to the genealogy of Jesus, which may sound boring to us, the genealogy of Jesus, and I don't know, maybe if you're into your own genealogy, it might make sense that there's so much to those layers of ancestry. And yet if you look to the 23andMe of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, and you pay attention to those names that are mentioned, the first of the 4 women whose names make the list, the first female name in that list is Rahab. I think that's important. I think it's important really for 2 primary reasons. I think it's important because Rahab had an interesting way of making a living. And then secondly, she's not a Jew. She's not a Hebrew. She's not an Israelite. And the story of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, I think, points us toward what Jesus is going to accomplish in His ministry. Regardless of who you are or where you come from, redemption can be possible. Regardless of what your background, what your story, what your history, what you've done, what you've not done, what sort of background you have, whether it's something that you've created or something that you couldn't help. Redemption is available for all. For your story to intersect the story of God. That's Joshua 2. Joshua 3 and 4. In Joshua chapters 3 and 4, it's all about to happen. Israel has been waiting for this moment. Israel is about to enter this land that God has promised to them. As an estimated millions upon millions of Israelites are led into the promised land. And as they cross the Jordan River. Now, out in front of them are the priests from the tribe of Levi, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant demonstrates the presence of God among His people. The enclosure upon the top of the Ark is referred to as the mercy seat. And it's referred to as the mercy seat because the Ark, even though it might appear like a box to us, it's a throne. Even as Israel is engaged in covenant relationship with God, and as they worship God, as they have the tabernacle and then the temple, the Ark of the Covenant is placed in the most holy place within the temple because it's the location where heaven touches earth, the throne room of God. And yet as soon as the foot of the first priest, those who are carrying this Ark of the Covenant, as soon as the first foot of the first priest touches the water of the Jordan River, the water is dammed up all the way to the city of Adam. I've always felt like that was significant. And Israel they cross the dry Jordan riverbed to the other side. And where have we seen this before? It's evident that God apparently enjoys doing this among His people. We saw it before at the Red Sea as Israel is delivered from their Egyptian slavery. As they're led by Moses out of their bondage. As they began this journey out of Egypt. And then as Joshua and Israel, as they cross the Jordan River into the promised land, And if you look at the description, they cross over in battle formation, prepared for what God is going to do. As they cross over and as they camp at Gilgal, Joshua gives instruction to the tribes, one man from each tribe, to select a stone from the dry riverbed. And then as they go to Gilgal, as they've entered into the promised land, they construct an altar. They build a monument of these memorial stones as a remembrance. And the goal of the altar was not only to praise and to worship God, but the goal of the altar was so that in generations to come, when their children and children's children looked upon that altar, those memorial stones, and they asked what those stones were for, Israel was to tell the story of the faithfulness of God. We're almost there, I promise. Joshua 5 and 6. In Joshua chapter 5 and 6, Israel travels to the city of Jericho. They walk around the city once a day for 6 days, blowing trumpets. Who knows what the people of Jericho thought about this? What are these Hebrews doing? This is not the way it works. This looks more like a parade than an attack, and Joshua appears to be the drum major. But then on the 7th day, they do it 7 times. And then with a great shout, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down because God is the one providing the victory. And as we've said before, that number 7, always in the Bible, associated with perfection, wholeness, completion. These stories are more than stories. They're events. They're moments in time. They're moments in time for God's people then, but they're also moments in time for God's people today. And we look at these stories and these events and we see the faithfulness of God. How God is proving Himself to His people then. How God is proving Himself to His people now. And we see the faithfulness of God. I want to encourage you to continue to read through Joshua. If you look at the next chapter, Joshua chapter 7, you need to read it. You've got Achan's sin at Ai. When there's sin in the camp, everyone suffers. Joshua chapter 10, you need to read it. The story of when the sun stands still. But I want to fast forward toward the end of Joshua, chapter 24, and verse 15, and read the verses that were the statements that were made earlier. Joshua speaking to Israel after all of this had occurred. He says, if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods of your ancestors, the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, referring to Egypt, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. Joshua says that there needs to be a line drawn in the sand for us. Who do you belong to? Who do you follow? Who do you believe? Who do you belong to? He says, you make your decision, and your decision is your decision. But my decision is this. Me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And I love that faith. I love that faithfulness and that decisiveness and that boldness and that courage that we see. And that's the story of Joshua. It's a story of strength and boldness, courage. It's a story of taking action. It's a story of exploration. The story of Joshua is a story of adventure. I think we like that. But I think of everything encompassed within Joshua's story, and even within the entire book that bears his name, I think there's one word. There's one word that is at the forefront. There's one word that all of this is about. There's one word that we are to take from the story of Joshua. And it's the word remember. That's the word that is, whether it's said or not, whether it's out front or not, that's the word that's front and center with the story of Joshua. Remember. Remember. Remember what God has done. Remember what God has done throughout the history of the world. But remember what God has done in your life. Don't forget. Don't lose sight. Remember how God has worked through people, through events. Remember how God has been at work through difficulties and through adversities. Remember how God has been at work through blessings and through things that have occurred in your life that are inexplicable, except that God is the one who's leading the way. Remember what God has done. Remember who you are in His eyes. Remember how God sees you. Not how you see yourself at times, not how others see you even, and especially, but how does God see you? Remember who you are in His eyes. Remember what God has done. Remember who God has called you to be. That's so much of the story of Scripture. Remember who God has called you to be. You were bought with a price. This is what God has done. This is what God offers. How are we going to respond to that? Remember what God has done. Remember who you are in His eyes. Remember who He has called you to be. Remember His promises. Remember the promises of God. You and I, we participate every Sunday in a moment of remembrance, do we not? We come to the table together, even if not at a physical table, at this metaphorical table. Kurt, as he just described and explained earlier, what takes place as we commune with God and as we commune with one another. As Jesus takes the unleavened bread from the table of Passover, there in the upper room on the night before He's crucified, as He takes the unleavened bread, as He takes the wine, and as He gives it to His disciples, what does He say? Remember. Remember. Do this in remembrance of me. This is a memorial. This is a reminder. Remember. Jesus, as He takes those elements from the Passover table, there in that upper room in Jerusalem, the door of which is marked with the blood of the Lamb because it's the time of Passover. Put all of that together. It's an event that Israel at that point, 2,000 years ago, it's an event that had been taking place for about 1,480 years prior to that. Every year, Israel celebrated Passover. And Jesus takes those elements from the table. Jews today continue to celebrate Passover, right? But for 1,480 years prior to Jesus taking those elements from that table and instituting the Lord's Supper, instituting communion, the message had been the same. Remember. And Jesus, as He gives us this connection and this memorial, Jesus says the same thing. Remember. Remember. Remember what God has done to set you free. Remember what God has done to make you His own. Those were the words that were on the heart and the minds of those who entered into that home with Jesus in that upper room 2,000 years ago. Remember. And that's the word that resounds with the conquests of Joshua. Remember. As these events are to Israel, so the gospel of Jesus is to us. The goal of remembering. The goal of remembering is worship. That's the goal of remembering. The goal of remembering is repentance and being faithful. That's the goal of remembrance is being faithful. The goal of remembering is trusting and having confidence that God is God and possessing the boldness to step through whatever doors God opens for us. Because sometimes we're just so fearful of walking through those doors that God is opening for us. But His call to us in those instances is to remember. Even if and when His call feels outside of our comfort zone, or beyond what we even envision as the realm of possibility. Has God ever called you to do something that you believe was a response to faithfulness, and yet you just hadn't had the boldness or the courage to do what God was calling you to do? Remember. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Make the decision that regardless of what anyone else is doing, regardless of what it might cost, regardless of what changes have to be made, regardless of what sacrifices have to be made, regardless of what fears have to be overcome, if it's a response to faithfulness, to make the decision to be strong and courageous and to refuse to operate out of a place of fear. Make the decision, the declaration that Joshua made. I don't know what y'all are going to do. Joshua was from Texas. I don't know what y'all are going to do. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Whatever's going on around us, whatever my fears and concerns, as for me and my house, with the sphere of influence that I have, we're going to serve the Lord. I think if we do that, we'll be doing something right. Not one promise of God has ever failed. You get that? Not one promise of God has ever failed, because He's God. And He alone is God. And the word that must be ever on our hearts as faithful followers of Jesus is the word remember. And so this morning I wonder, what does remembering require of you? Remembering the faithfulness of God. Remember how God has proven Himself faithful throughout the ages. Remembering how God has proven Himself faithful in your own life. Remembering His promises. Remembering His covenant. Remembering His call. I wonder what the call of remembering is for you. What call does remembering place upon your life? My hope and my prayer is that whatever that call of faithfulness is, my prayer is that we would each have the boldness to do such things. For you, it might be that what remembering requires this morning is a faithful response to the gospel of Jesus. For you, maybe you've been a Christian for a long time, but maybe you've wandered from God and haven't been following His Son faithfully. What a beautiful thing it would be to be a part of a restoration of life and faith today. Maybe for you, remembering requires a faithful response to the gospel by being baptized into Christ. And if that's you this morning, we would be so honored to walk alongside of you and to assist you as you put on Christ as Lord. If you're in need of responding to the gospel of Jesus in any way this morning, I ask you to come forward. I'll meet you as you do, as we stand and as we sing.